One of the most prolific personalities in all of baseball came from the broadcast booth in Harry Caray. Throughout a 5-decade-plus announcing career with 4 different teams, Caray's unique and memorable voice and personality made him an icon past baseball. So let's look at the career of Harry Caray.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
Caray kept much of his early life private, and that includes when he was born. Different sources said he was born between 1915 and 1920, though Caray shrugged off any questions of his age. However, when he passed away, St. Louis City health records showed that he was born on March 1st, 1914 in St. Louis, with his birth name being Harry Christopher Carabino. He never met his father, and his mother passed away when he was about 8. Being primarily raised by his aunt, and coming from a poor family, he began selling newspapers at the age of 8, and when he could afford it, he would go watch the Cardinals at Sportsman's Park, which he described as one of the brightest parts of his childhood. And he also played baseball as a middle infielder, and was good enough to be offered a spot to play at the University of Alabama, which he did not accept as he could not afford it. And he began working odd jobs after high school, and also earned some additional money by playing semi-pro baseball on the weekends. He attracted the attention of some scouts, and was invited to a tryout camp for the Cardinals, but he didn't have the physical skills to make it, and he found a steady job as an assistant sales manager for a company that manufactured gym equipment. And he continued to attend Cardinal games, and one thing that he felt was the games were much more exciting in person than the play-by-play descriptions he heard on the radio, and he was convinced that he could do a better job. So much so that he sent a letter to Merrill Jones, the general manager of KMOX, saying that he could do better. Impressed by his enthusiasm, Jones set up an audition for Caray for the station. They felt he had a great voice, but he needed some experience. And so Jones helped him get a job as an announcer at a station in Joliet, Illinois. He began covering high school and junior college events, along with summer league softball and bowling. It was also here where he changed his name from Harry Cabina to Harry Caray, as he felt it sounded better. He would then move to a station in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The station carried broadcasts of Detroit Tigers games, and he would host pre- and post-game shows while also calling basketball and football for Western Michigan. He also got his first experience calling baseball, calling a semi-pro tournament in Battle Creek, and it was there when he first uttered 2 phrases that he would use throughout his career. The first being his home run call, and of course the other phrase being "holy cow," saying he trained himself to say when something exciting happened instead of cursing. The phrase not being invented by Caray, but that phrase mainly became popular because of him. And in the midst of World War II, he would try to enlist in the armed forces, but he was rejected due to his bad eyesight. He would move back to St. Louis, where he began working for KXOK in 1944, eventually getting his own 15-minute sports show, where he took a controversial approach of covering news and also criticizing, something that brought him plenty of attention, especially when the 2 St. Louis teams in the Browns and the Cardinals met in the 1944 World Series. He would call other events sponsored by the Greasedick Brothers Brewery, and that brewery planned to sponsor Cardinals and Browns games in 1945, and they were looking for a sportscaster for the job. Caray lobbied for the job, and he was initially turned down in favor of the veteran announcer, France Laux, with the reason being that Laux described the action of a game in a way that allowed someone to listen and read the newspaper undisturbed, which infuriated Caray, telling his boss, "Why spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to sponsor baseball, and when your commercial comes on, you're busy reading the paper," saying, "You need someone who's going to keep the fan interested in the game, because if they're paying attention to the game, they'll pay attention to the commercial." And after that outburst, he was immediately hired. He teamed with former catcher and manager Gabby Street to broadcast Cardinals and Browns games over WIL. And since there were no exclusive broadcast rights, they were competing with multiple stations, including the established France Laux and Johnny O'Hara with Dizzy Dean. And with Caray's enthusiasm and Street's analysis, the two gained a following in St. Louis. Though he wouldn't get to call the Cardinals World Series victory in 1946, he got great news when the Greasedick brothers were granted exclusive rights to Cardinals broadcast, meaning Caray and Street would be the only broadcasters for the Cardinals. And this was big because at the time, the Cardinals had the largest network in baseball with 54 affiliate stations that grew to 91 by 1954. And though it's hard to believe now, the Cardinals were actually the furthest west and southern MLB team for quite some time. So they represented much more than just St. Louis, with many in the surrounding states becoming fans because that was the only team they could listen to on a daily basis. Caray will continue to be the main broadcaster through changes in ownership, sponsors changing to Anheuser-Busch, and new partners after Street passed away in 1951, with his later partners being Joe Garaggioli and Jack Buck. And while Caray was popular, his different style also attracted plenty of controversy, this mainly coming from the fact that Caray was not afraid to speak his mind, saying, "You can't be controversial by design because it comes off as phony. It has to be spontaneous. I'm like a fan. If I see something on the field I don't like, I react the way a fan does. If I think a player isn't hustling, I'll say so. If I think a manager is making mistakes platooning, I'll say so." When I was with the Cardinals, I was always in the hot box with managers like Eddie Stanky and Eddie Dyer. I've always said the managers and owners don't like me, but the people love me. Sam Musial himself agreed with this, saying he was just a big fan who wanted to see the players do well, and he would always end up rooting for the players. And Caray would have plenty of highlights during his time in St. Louis. He was one of the announcers on the mic during Bobby Thompson's shot heard around the world in 1951. He was on the call for Sam Musial's 3,000th hit, and he would call the 1964, 67, and 68 World Series in which the Cardinals played, getting dual announcing duties with NBC over radio and TV. And Caray proved that he was a man of the people past just how he announced games. When he wasn't broadcasting, he was usually mingling and partying with fans. He said he would make friends with a bartender in 2 minutes, and if there were only a few people at the bar, he would give the house a drink and tell them to lock the front door. But this lifestyle, along with the constant traveling that comes with being a sportscaster, would take a toll on his personal life. He divorced his wife of 12 years in 1949, and his 10-year-old son Skip found out about it on a headline on the front page of a newspaper. And after the divorce, Skip, his brother Chris, and his sister Patricia would see even less of their father. And his time in St. Louis came to a rather unfortunate end. And his career in life almost came to an end 1 year before that. November of 1968, Caray was leaving a hotel in St. Louis at 1 in the morning, and he would be struck by a car, sending him 35 feet in the air, breaking both his legs, his shoulder, and his nose. The car being driven by a 21-year-old without a license or insurance who just got back from Vietnam, literally that morning. He recovered months before expected and returned to call his 25th season in St. Louis, and it would end up being his last. The Cardinals did not renew his contract after the season, and the main reason for that is the rumors that he had an affair with Gussie Busch's daughter-in-law, something he denied and continued to deny. And he wouldn't be unemployed long, as by 1970, he was the announcer for the Oakland Athletics. And one thing he was not going to change was his style. Charles Finley wanted him to start saying Holy Mule in honor of their mascot, but he kept saying Holy Cow. And the problems lied mainly with a strained relationship with Monte Moore, who was more restrained in comparison to Caray. And with a few disputes with Finley and a desire to return home, Caray came back to the Midwest as his next job was in Chicago for the White Sox, replacing the legendary Bob Elson. And during this time, the White Sox were facing some difficult financial times, and they were unable to offer Caray the same salary that he had before, but they would offer an attendance clause. Another thing Caray was a great promoter, so the White Sox offered him a $10,000 bonus for every 100,000 fans the White Sox drew over 600,000. In that year, the White Sox got 800,000 fans to show up, so Caray got an extra $20,000. And in his third season with the team, he got an additional duty of providing play-by-play on television. He appeared on WSNS for the first and last 3 innings, and he went to the radio during the middle 3 innings. The new form of baseball media making him a star in Chicago, just like he was in St. Louis. And also like he did in St. Louis, he mingled with the fans. He would sometimes take beers out to the outfield bleachers and broadcast the game from there. And he continued to celebrate into the early morning hours, becoming known to the locals as the mayor of Rush Street. And he continued to be critical when he felt necessary, putting him at odds with players and manager Chuck Tanner, to the point that John Allen was planning on firing him. But Bill Veeck would buy the team, and knowing how popular Caray was, he kept him on the air. And perhaps most notable from his time on the South Side came in a surprise. One night, Veeck heard Caray singing Take Me Out to the Ball Game during the 7th inning stretch, and the next night, he secretly installed a PA mic in the booth and turned it on when Caray began singing, which shocked him when he suddenly heard his voice ringing throughout the stadium. And after the game, when he asked what happened, Veeck said he was waiting his whole life for the right person to sing that song. And seeing everyone join in when Caray began singing, he responded enthusiastically, thus beginning the tradition of Harry Caray leading the fans in an off-key rendition of Take Me Out to the Ball Game during the 7th inning stretch. In that same year, he began calling games with Jimmy Purcell, another outspoken commentator who would anger players, but that led to more viewers to the team than ever. But in 1981, the team was sold to Jerry Reinsdorf and Eddie Einhorn, and they were interested in putting the White Sox games on a subscription-only channel, and Caray strongly felt that it would not work. And already not thrilled about working under new owners, he asked the other Chicago team if they were interested in hiring him to replace Jack Brickhouse. And they were. And with that, Harry Caray was the new voice of the Chicago Cubs. And it was here where he became even more of a celebrity past the city that he was in. And the reason was, Cubs games were broadcast on Superstation WGN. And by the late 80s, WGN was in 30 million homes. Having some luck in calling on a huge radio station in the beginning of his career, and now getting to call games on one of the first cable TV superstations. But either way, in both situations, many were tuning in just for him, coming in at a time when the Cubs were competitive for the first time in decades, while his tradition of singing Take Me Out to the Ball Game during the 7th inning stretch became more popular, while also keeping his tradition of upsetting players and mispronouncing their names, as his trademark cartoon character-like look with his barrel-shaped wide-rim glasses becoming recognizable across the country. And that tenure almost came to a quick end when he suffered a stroke in February of 1987. Amidst the numerous well wishes he received, he worked with a therapist so he could return to the broadcast. And he was unable to return by opening day, so the Cubs had a few guest broadcasters, including Brent Musburger and Bill Murray. He would return in May, and he received a call from the White House welcoming him back. That same year would also see the opening of Harry Caray's Italian Steakhouse in Chicago. Established from a partnership between Caray and restaurateur Grant DePorter, the restaurant specializes in steaks and Italian cuisine, with 7 locations being established in the years after, with the original location featuring an array of memorabilia and was later named on the National Register of Historic Places. And as the Cubs won the NL East for the second time with Caray in the booth in 1989, he admitted that he was not as sharp in the years after his stroke. He would mispronounce a lot of names, something that he always did, and sometimes did on purpose. If a game was moving too slow, he would pronounce a player's name backwards, or just permanently call them by the wrong name, such as Delino DeShields becoming Delino DeSanders, or Rafael Palmeiro becoming Rafael Palermo.
And Palermo!
And it was during this time where generations of Carays in the broadcast booth became established. His son Skip had been with the Braves in the 70s, and his son Chip would broadcast Orlando Magic games, while also later calling Braves games, and now being the voice of the Cardinals, while his son Chris is now calling games for the A's. And in 1998, 4 years after he collapsed from an irregular heartbeat, causing him to cut down on his traveling and alcohol consumption, he was scheduled to call Cubs games with his grandson Chip. But on Valentine's Day in 1998, Harry collapsed during a dinner in California, and unfortunately, he never gained consciousness, passing away 4 days later. His funeral was held in Chicago, while he was buried at All Saints Cemetery in Chicago. On opening day in 1998, his third wife Dutchie led the Wrigley Field crowd in a rendition of Take Me Out to the Ballgame, a tradition that continues to this day, as numerous guests have made their way to Wrigley, and after his death, a statue of him was dedicated outside of Wrigley Field, later being moved to the outfield entrance, one of the most recognizable symbols at the historic stadium. And the reason Caray had such a lasting effect is because he was truly a man of the people, an announcer you could tell was a fan first, and an announcer second. A controversial approach, especially at the beginning of his career, it was the approach that made him so memorable for generations. He would say, "I don't mind being known as a fan. Listen, baseball is a part of Americana, and nothing is going to supplant it, and no other sport can match it. I'm a fan's announcer." Hopefully you liked this video, and if so, please consider liking and subscribing for new videos every week. Thank you.